Welcome to Good Game, the show for gamers by gamers. I'm Hex.
And I'm Barjo, and this week we'll be staring down the barrel of Sniper Elite
V2. We'll also be taking a look at Deep Black, and Barjo, I think you're gonna need these.
Why is that, Hex?
Well, because most of the game is set underwater, and I know how you feel about water levels.
I don't like them. But first, can you guess the game for this week?
News time, Barjo. Swim away. Swimming.
Good game.
Social game publisher Zynga is taking French publisher Kabojo to court, accusing them of trademark infringement for using the suffix ville. Last year, Kabojo released Pyramidville. Zynga claims the game's title will cause players to think the game is part of their Ville series, which includes the titles Farmville, Cityville, and Castleville. Zynga is seeking damages equal to 3 times the profit Kabojo earns from Pyramidville. A Kickstarter project for a video game managed to raise almost $5,000 before it was discovered to be a scam. The project had aimed to raise over $80,000 to develop the game Mythic, the story of gods and men. However, several people noticed that certain aspects of the project seemed dubious. Most obviously, the creators had directly copied the game's reward tiers from another Kickstarter project. Artwork and photos of the development studio were also taken from other sources and slightly altered.
Good game.
Legend of Grimrock is the kind of PC game that hasn't been around since the early 90s. It's a party-based dungeon crawler where you and your adventurers all share the same perspective, or a communal eye. It's the sort of game that you'll look at and go, how could this possibly be fun? But then after 5 minutes, you're pulled into this world of traps and puzzles and adventure at every turn.
Developer Almost Human is calling this a spiritual successor to games like Dungeon Master, where the thrill lies in delving deeper and deeper through the levels of a dungeon, dodging traps, solving riddles, and defeating monsters.
The story is simple, but it doesn't need to be any more complex. You're prisoners, criminals cast into the pit at the top of a mountain, upon which your crimes are immediately absolved. If you can somehow make it to an exit and walk free, good on you.
You can start with a prefab party or create your own individual characters, but I always enjoy customizing my heroes, so I'd recommend you do the same. You can choose from a human, minotaur, insectoid, and lizard, as well as classes of fighter, mage, and rogue. The obvious choice is 2 warriors up front to soak up the damage with ranged fighters at the back, but I liked that you could also create a party full of wizards if you wanted a bit of challenge.
Or punishment.
Yeah. You can also play with old school mode enabled, which means that the game doesn't auto-map the dungeon for you, so you have to get out some grid paper and a pen and do that yourself.
And you do really rely on that map too. Although I found if you just leave torches lying around the place, it kind of marks where you've been.
Bit of Hansel and Gretel method there.
Movement is made in a grid-like fashion, step by step, forwards, backwards, turning, and strafing. And there's an odd kind of momentum that you have as you move, which takes a bit of getting used to. But for a game made by just 4 guys, the dungeon looks great, doesn't it? Some nice eerie lighting effects. Good wall detail.
Oh yeah, I love that moss there. You'll want to equip a torch too, though, to feel a bit more confident exploring those dark hallways. There's a real atmosphere to this, and I've got to say, Barjo, I found it pretty spooky. It almost reminded me of Amnesia a bit, and that every time you turn a corner, you expect a monster to be there. And there's not. And then there is, but...
Yeah, you can really cut that tension with a knife, and I think it's because you're so vulnerable, and that's why it's so thrilling. Also, every enemy is evil in some way, and they're utterly terrifying. Even though they're stuck to this grid, they're still really scary.
Even the snails, they look so cute, and then they have these horrible teeth.
I like the way they explode, though.
Yeah, they kind of like turn into confetti. Yeah. I found that luring enemies around in circles was a pretty effective way of taking them down, because you can get your hits in and then move before they can even get a sniff. You know, it works so long as you haven't been hemmed in.
Yes, I make good use of those doors with chains and levers.
Yeah, it's a good thing most monsters don't know how to open doors. But how'd you find the combat mechanics? Suitably old school and fiddly?
From the look of this game, I expected it to be turn-based, but it's not. It's real-time, and I was not expecting the stress of managing my party in real time. You have to right-click on the individual icons of the weapons under each character portrait to attack. And if your archer runs out of arrows, then you've got to open his inventory and equip more, all in real time while you're getting eaten alive. The hardest thing, though, is casting spells. Here you have to open your spell book, click a combination of runes, all by memory, and then click again to cast. Every second is so precious, it's quite stressful.
Yeah, the warriors have it easy, don't they? Just click and wait for the cooldown. But I suppose you can kind of justify the casting of spells in your own imagination if you think of that spellcaster trying to calm her mind and recant these complex spells in the heat of battle. By comparison, you know, a guy with a sword doesn't really have to think too hard.
I just wish it would at least remember the last one you cast. It would have been nice to have some more hotkeys, though. I've got this whole keyboard full of buttons. Just use more of them.
No, but that's not the point. I mean, mages have some pretty powerful spells, so it's good that you can't just spam damage with them as easily as a guy swinging an axe. You can also crush plants in a mortar and pestle to make potions. But the recipes you'll mostly need to figure out for yourself.
I like that sometimes when you sleep to regain a bit of health, you're left with this mysterious message from someone who's trapped in the dungeon below you. You find notes from them left about the place too.
I was quite surprised I was getting lured into a story here, you know, trying to make sense of this horrendous dungeon and wondering what happened to all the adventurers who went before me.
Well, let's talk about the traps and puzzles, because they're a big part to why this game works. If you keep a keen eye on the walls you're passing, you'll sometimes spot small markings that are switches for secret doors or triggers to make something happen. There are lots of pits that open up and grates that slam shut, and magical warp fields that teleport you somewhere. There are also pressure pads which you can place items on or just trigger yourself. Some of the traps incorporate all of these, which make for some pretty brain-hurty puzzles, and you'll feel genuinely stuck.
You'll often come across riddles written on walls as clues, but I admit I use the internet to get past 1 or 2 points.
It made me think what it was like back before the internet, when we had to look in magazines and talk to friends to find solutions to these problems, or just give up.
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of old school game that they were trying to recreate, so I guess maybe it's just up to the player to walk away, sleep on it, and then try another solution the next day.
Yeah, and they are all logical solutions, and very, very clever, so you feel a bit stupid once you've shown the solution. Have modern games gone too easy on us, Hex? Have we become soft gamers?
Well, maybe. I think that's why Grimrock is gaining so much popularity, because it offers a tougher than usual nut to crack. But, you know, I really enjoyed this, Barjo. Exploring that mysterious dungeon was just so addictive.
Yeah, it's ironic that such an old school game feels so new and different. I had a great time. I'm giving it 8 out of 10 rubber chickens.
I'm gonna give it 8 as well.
Now, regular viewers may remember the Tiny Power animations from last year.
Well, now they're back, this time with an episodic drama set in an indie game studio. Here's episode 1.
Hans Booby!
Why are you so unhappy?
I feel like I'm waiting for something big to happen to me. Something that will change everything.
I think waiting around for this big thing is making you unhappy.
I just need to show everybody that I'm a somebody.
You are a somebody. To me.
Show everyone. Must show everyone.
Troy, it is me, Gilius Thunderhead from Golden Axe.
Golden what?
Chennai Muppet, Google it. You are going on a hero's journey.
Why?
Because what you want, you don't need. And what you need, you already have. Oi!
Sorry.
I'm going to give you an idea for a game that will change the world.
Cool. Xbox?
No, iOS.
Oh.
Well, do a PC version too. Chuck it on Steam.
Yes.
Good game.
Episode 2 next week.
Now, Deep Black is a downloadable third-person shooter set in the future where you play a kind of deep-sea diving spy character by the name of Cyrus Pierce, who looks remarkably similar to Isaac Clarke from Dead Space. At the start of the game, Pierce is hired by a private military organization called Sharon to break into a rival intelligence organization and try and find out about some sneaky new weapons tech they've been developing.
So far, only episode 1 has been released, and it has 3 chapters to play through. Both the writing and voice acting aren't great, and the intro story setup does very little to get you excited about the mission ahead of you. But you do have your cool Dead Space suit, a harpoon, a subterranean jetpack, and a few guns at your disposal. So you set about swimming and shooting your way through the enemy compound, taking out as many trigger-happy goons and angry robots as you can in the process.
You'll settle into a pretty predictable rhythm as you enter each room, wipe out a wave of enemies, swim through some tunnels and rinse repeat for the first part of the game, although the water action is surprisingly okay. Underwater droids will attempt to make life difficult for you, but you can use your harpoons, stun guns and melee attacks to take them down, though often this simply requires mashing B repeatedly. You can also perform some nice stealth kills by using your harpoon to pull enemies into the water and, well, knife them in the face.
This game was originally going to be called Underwater Wars, which is a pretty funny title, though I don't think Deep Black is necessarily much of an improvement. Perhaps they changed it because only about half this game is actually underwater, so maybe it was misleading. But being able to have underwater gunfights from behind cover is an interesting spin on the shooter formula. It's just a shame that these levels are so lifeless.
I also thought the cover system was a little bit inconsistent. There's plenty of cover in the open areas where you get fired at by multiple goons, but when moving between rooms, there's some doors and walls you can take cover behind and others you can't. And often it's a dead giveaway because the option to take cover will only be there if there are going to be enemies in the next room. It comes up with a big button prompt saying press A to go into cover, so you're rarely surprised.
Gunplay is your stock standard stop and pop action with a seriously punishing difficulty spike in the last chapter. Overall, I didn't enjoy the gunplay, or the guns for that matter. You've got this cool futuristic suit that's got an underwater jetpack. Give me some futuristic guns.
Remember, I did like that in certain areas you could reprogram droids to fight for you. I just wish more of that kind of thing had been integrated into the later sections of the game where you actually really needed it. I went insane in the last chapter, Barjo, especially that fracking giant mechanical crab fight.
Giant mechanical crab.
It was just brutal and painfully unforgiving. I rage quit on several occasions and it just made that last chapter a real chore.
To be honest, this whole game felt like a chore to me. I know it's not a big AAA title, but we've come to expect a certain level from third-person shooters, and it just doesn't have that kind of spit and polish.
My favourite part of this game are the hilariously over-the-top shrieks of death from the enemies. They're brilliant. They're like Wilhelm's ghost returned to die more loudly and melodramatically than before.
They're especially good underwater. And they go on for so long after the enemy has died, and because that AI dialogue repeats so much, you hear them over and over again, which would be annoying if they weren't so funny.
Negative, too high tech.
Overall, I was pretty disappointed with Deep Black. While the locations seem to get a little bit more interesting towards the end, gameplay seems to only get worse. Also, a promo write-up I'd read of this game earlier promised me puzzles. Well, there are no puzzles here unless you count using your harpoon to open 1,000,000 doors and gates. There's also a multiplayer mode, but I could not for the life of me find a game no matter how hard I tried, so it looks like other people felt the same way as we did about this jaunt into underwater spammy shooterville.
I always feel sorry for the developers when I jump into a multiplayer lobby and there's just no one playing. No one in the world playing this game.
Sounds familiar.
I think their main goal here was to take a shooter and put it underwater and try and do something with that, but they didn't do enough with that mechanic. While I do think they got the movement in the water right, it didn't feel sluggish, which is what I was expecting, but overall it just feels relentlessly bland. I'm giving it 3.5 out of 10 rubber chickens.
It's 4 out of 10 from me. Now, in keeping with the aquatic theme, Goose wades into an evolution of virtual liquid.
Good game.
Back in the early days, video game characters had no clue how to swim. Even when our video game characters did finally learn how to swim, our fear of water was kept alive by all those creepy monsters lurking in the deep. The water itself even felt like it was leaping out and trying to drown us.
Really?
To trace the roots of our gaming hydrophobia, we need to go back 30 years to the birth of the platformer. Pitfall introduced water as a lethal hazard, an approach many others soon adopted. Video game water may as well have been sulfuric acid because most of the time dipping your toe in was pretty much lethal.
Oh, geez, no.
This was partly to inject some danger, but mostly it was because swimming and splashing water was beyond the simple game engines of the early 80s. As the complexity of the platformer evolved, including water levels became the new de facto standard. They provided developers with an easy way to add variety into the template. However, they normally left gamers with a depressing, sinking feeling. Super Mario Bros. Established the water level template that many games would go on to sheepishly follow. Unfortunately, these levels were the worst part of the game because Mario's precise controls became painfully slippery when wet. There were also some glaring inconsistencies about how the game chose to deal with water. Mario must have had hidden gills because he could stay underwater for as long as he wanted. Bizarrely, he lost all these magical aquatic powers when he was on dry land. Sonic chose to take the wet stuff a little more seriously by adding the danger of drowning. This, however, was a bit of a mixed blessing. It upped the realism, but the murky controls were an absolute disaster. Thankfully, Golden Axe finally turned the tables and let us drown our enemies. As 2D graphics improved, so too did the aquatic gameplay. Donkey Kong Country featured gorgeous levels that were fun to navigate thanks to improved swimming controls and the inclusion of a fish you could even ride. It was Super Ghouls and Ghosts that set the high watermark for 2D platformers though. Huge tidal waves would tear portions of the level right from under your feet. And rather than opting for slippery controls, a floating raft was used to keep the same tight platforming mechanics on a giant heaving ocean backdrop. I'm not getting in that. However, there were a handful of 2D titles where water was more of a tranquil playground. You could go for a relaxing fish on the Atari 2600, enjoy a surf in California Games, or frolic about the peaceful water world of Echo the Dolphin. In the late 90s, the arrival of 3D was a watershed moment. The floodgates opened, unleashing an amazing new range of aquatic gameplay to dive right on into.
"2D classics like Rayman and Mario were quick to experiment with 3D water.
It wasn't until Zelda that clever water-based puzzles finally emerged. Like using metal boots to sink to inaccessible depths and pulling switches to flood chambers. Then the aptly named Ocean created Wetrix, a puzzle game based on water simulation. You captured water drops on a floating platform, while power-ups changed the conditions. Later, games like Half-Life 2 and Resident Evil 4 evolved water puzzles with floating physics. One of the important genres that 3D created was wave-based racing games. Wave Race 64 rendered everything from still as glass lakes to pounding surf. The tide also went out between the laps, changing which bits of the track you could race on. A storm of aquatic races soon followed, but most like Hydro Thunder and Bloodwake just sank without a trace. It wasn't until Nintendo's sequel Wave Race Blue Storm and its rival Splashdown that we saw worthwhile advances. Today's consoles powered a new wave of water effects that arrived on the scene with a big splash. The flat, lifeless water of yesteryear was washed away and replaced with sun-speckled beauty. Water had gone from a loathed element to the highlight of most graphics engines. We've seen Arctic wastelands, submarine adventures, rain-swept decks, and even some wet t-shirts along the way. Nice. While water-based races have dried up, we have seen it cleverly injected into some recent games. One of Trials Evolution's tracks used water to fling you around like a cork. And MotorStorm Pacific Rift had a love-hate relationship with water. Driving through it cooled your engine, but straying out a fraction too deep meant instant death. Just Cause 2 was another aquatic highlight, especially when you skydive kilometers straight down into the ocean. Plus, it's got the best boat jacking ever.
Tough luck, compadre.
WoW took water levels to a new depth with the Sheer. There were entire underwater quests to complete and massive sea monsters you could battle. Recently, water's even been used as a central plot device. BioShock plunged us into an underwater world that was literally dripping with atmosphere. It wedged gamers between the decaying insanity indoors and the constant pressure of the ocean depths outside. The game also injected water into your arsenal, making it lethal for any enemy stupid enough to take a dip. Hydrophobia's convincing water tech should have capitalised perfectly on the decades of fear we've had of water. But repetitive gameplay flushed away most of its potential. Then the noir classic Heavy Rain drenched both its gameplay and plot in water. The plot has a serial killer drowning his victims in rising stormwater, and the unyielding rain is a metaphor for the depressing tone, leading to a desperate fight to escape a sinking car. The game's not all bleak though, because it used water to whet our appetites with some raunchy his and her shower scenes. So there you go. Over the past few decades, water has really undergone a caterpillar to butterfly transformation. And after forcing us to suffer numerous water levels and plenty of drownings, it's now a stunning highlight and a compelling plot device.
Nice pants, Goose. The sniper is the true ninja of the modern battlefield. He or she must be patient, methodical, and most of all, invisible.
Yes, there's something quite like finding that perfect perch in the battlefield and scoping out your enemies from a distance to execute a precise headshot.
Sniper Elite V2 puts you in the place of an old school assassin and allows you to get up close and personal with your enemy from a distance. We should warn you, some of the images in this game are pretty graphic. The original Sniper Elite was released in 2005, and it put you deep behind enemy lines in war-torn Berlin a few days before the end of World War II. You played Carl Fairburn, a US secret agent disguised as a German sniper. It was your job to obtain nuclear weapons information before those sneaky Russians could.
Maybe I can flank them.
Well, Sniper Elite V2 is not so much a sequel as it is a remake. You still play as Carl and you're still stuck deep in war-torn Germany, but this time you're racing to stop the launch of German V2 rockets, each loaded with a new chemical weapon that could alter the outcome of the war.
Wolf, as a plan, V2 rockets.
It's not a very creative stretch from the original story, but fortunately the plot takes the backseat pretty quickly and stays there.
Before each mission you're given a moody monologue briefing, and other than that there's only a handful of cutscenes, but heck, I don't really mind this because I feel like I've played every single World War II scenario out there, so I was happy just to cruise along on this wafer-thin storyline.
Yeah, I agree. At first I thought this was actually a direct remake of the original, not helped by that confusing title.
I learned that the V actually stands for Versagensswesten, but it means vengeance weapon.
Nice German. This straightforward storytelling also applies to the objectives you'll face in the 10 campaign missions. Each has you pushing deeper into battle-weary Berlin as you take out convoys, assassinate high-ranking officers, and hunt down important documents that reveal the whereabouts of your next objective.
I kept looking, hoping to find some clue.
It's bare-bones stuff, especially the levels themselves. Berlin is a bit of a ghost town apart from the pockets of Krauts and Reds you'll encounter. It's just you, your wits, and of course your trusty rifle.
It's the gameplay that will pull you through this, not the narrative. Each level is constructed to channel you through a linear path that will eventually lead to an open shooter gallery dotted with enemies. Some will be patrolling, some stationed on machine guns, and even the occasional enemy sniper camped up high with a cheeky bottle of wine. And there's a real satisfaction in setting up your posse, marking out all the enemies, and then taking them out before they even knew what hit them.
It's a nice change from the usual run and gunning we're used to seeing in historical war games, isn't it? A nice touch is the way you can use environmental sounds like loud explosions or the chime of a bell tower to cover the sound of your rifle. and this means you can clear an entire area without a single guard noticing, which felt particularly badass.
Yeah, that stuff was fantastic. I also like the slow-mo X-ray kill cam, which we've seen before in games like Fallout and Max Payne, but there's extra detail here that make it that much more impactful. Keeping your heart rate down allows you to hold your breath, which in turn slows time to make the shot.
The second that slow motion kicks in, you know you've nailed the shot.
Hitting your target often rewards you with a detailed X-ray that displays a full skeletal system with vital organs that can shatter and explode on impact. That's gonna tickle. Hex, at first I was a huge fan of these slow-mo X-ray kills because they do punctuate a precisely placed shot. But after a while, with no option to skip them, I turned the frequency of them down in the settings, and sadly it's then that the real flaws of this game start to show through.
Yeah, for one, the enemy AI is hilariously incompetent. Occasionally you're forced to go all Sam Fisher, sneaking around close quarters, stealthily snapping necks. But enemy behaviour is so sporadic and buggy, most patrolling Nazi would just stare blankly at me before turning around and goose-stepping off again.
Yeah, and the camera and controls are pretty sticky indoors too, so I gave up using that cover system early on. Luckily, the enemy AI is easy to exploit, so you can just run around town, Tommy gun a-blazing.
I hated those indoor sections. I mean, this is a sniping game. Don't confine me to tiny rooms. I definitely preferred getting back outside and into the streets. Luckily, the later levels do open up a bit more, and then you'll have to watch out for roving patrols and deadly tanks. In these situations, learning how to tag enemies with binoculars, set landmines, or set wire traps become crucial for survival.
Or you can just shoot the glowing red fuel caps on the back of the tanks.
I know, what's up with that? Who designs a tank with a giant flammable fuel tank on the back?
Yes, there's some pretty gamey stuff in this game, like your typical red barrels scattered around. Trucks also have rather nice explosions if you hit their fuel tanks, and everything can be solved with a bullet.
If it all feels a little too one-man army for you, you can turn up the difficulty, which add elements such as bullet drop and win factor. But be warned, this is for the purists out there, and enemy sniper shots will become as punishing as they are exhilarating.
All platforms let you play the entire campaign in co-op, which I'd recommend if you're feeling a bit lonely out there. But sadly, only the PC version has multiplayer versus, which I think is some of the best fun to be had in this game.
Sniping games do seem perfect for multiplayer on paper, though they can become a bit of a camp fest. But the maps here were really well thought out with multiple levels, and plenty of spots can turn into your own little sniper's nest.
Having to switch over to binoculars to tag an enemy was also a nice touch, especially when you spot someone who's just spotted you. Hey, that sinister kid is looking at me again. Hex, I don't think I should have liked this game as much as I did. It's strangely satisfying. That rush that you get from those slow motion kills.
Yeah, I could tell you're having a little bit more fun with this than I was. Look, it feels really copy-paste from the original, which luckily still works well for the most part, although some sections feel a little bit dated. But with no deathmatch for the console version, just cuts out a huge chunk of replayability, so it's 6 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, I'm giving it 7.5.
So did you guess the game for this week? It was the original Diablo, released in 1996. The game was a massive hit. It went on to influence dungeon crawlers for decades to come and cemented Blizzard as one of the most loved development studios. After more than a decade's development, Diablo 3 was released today, and we'll bring you that full review next week. Thanks to everyone who tweeted along with the hashtag GGTV, and don't forget that Good Games Spawn Point, our show for gamers of all ages, is over on ABC3 this weekend. We'll be taking a look at the phenomenon that is Minecraft and how it shapes up on the Xbox 360.
Well, until then, gamers, Barjo out.
Hex out. Okay, so in Diablo 3 beta, I played a demon hunter, right? She has a crossbow in each hand. How does she reload them? It's not like a Western.